and by the time I reached Carrillo Springs the sun was coming up, casting long shadows across the gas stations and old diners that lined the edge of the town like ghosts from another time. I found the storage facility listed on the back of the business card, a place called Desert Vault, with a rusted gate and keypad entry, and when I gave the woman at the counter the key and the unit number, she didn't even blink, just handed me a clipboard, had me sign a waiver, and then led me to a long corridor of metal roll-up doors that stretched further than I expected for a town this small. She left without saying a word, and when I unlocked Unit 48B and rolled the door up, what I found inside was not dusty furniture or forgotten junk, but a meticulously arranged wall of filing cabinets, electronic equipment, maps with pins and red string, and a folding table with a single laptop sitting in the center, plugged into a generator humming quietly in the corner. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no signs of age or abandonment. Everything was clean, organized, as if someone had been here just yesterday, or maybe even earlier that morning, and I stood there frozen, trying to understand who had prepared this place, how they had known I would come, and why they had waited until now to leave me here. I booted up the laptop, half expecting it to be locked or encrypted, but it went straight to a desktop filled with folders labeled with names, some I recognized from the documents Mason's widow gave me, and some that meant nothing to me at all. And in the center was a folder titled Exit Protocol, which I opened with a trembling hand, revealing video files, scanned documents, and a single audio recording dated 5 days before my father died. I clicked on the recording, and my father's voice filled the storage unit, calm, steady, and heartbreakingly familiar, telling me that if I was hearing this, it meant he hadn't made it, and that he was sorry he never told me the truth, but that it was safer for me not to know until I was old enough to handle the burden of what he had done and the choices he had made, and he warned me not to go looking for revenge, not to try and expose anyone, but to make a choice. Either walk away and destroy everything in the unit, or step into the life he had run from and finish what he started. I listened to that audio message again and again, each time hoping I had misheard something, some hidden meaning or code that would make all of this make sense, but no matter how many times I played it, the message stayed the same. My father was gone. He had been running from something powerful and deeply embedded in systems far beyond anything I had ever imagined, and now, whether I liked it or not, I was part of that story simply because I had found what he had hidden and followed the trail he never wanted me to take. The most haunting part of the recording wasn't even the confession or the warning, it was the pause right before he said my name, as if even in death he had hesitated to pull me into this world, and that hesitation made it clear that whatever he had done, whatever he had discovered, he believed it was dangerous enough to destroy everything and everyone connected to it. After the message ended, I spent hours going through the folders on the laptop, reading names, timelines, transcripts, watching grainy video footage of meetings in hotel rooms, secret handoffs, and parking garages, and one clip that showed a man being followed through an airport before disappearing through an unmarked door guarded by two people in plain clothes with the same insignia on their collars, a symbol I had seen once before on the corner of a file in Carl's house, and again in one of the photos from the wooden box in the cabin. There was something about that symbol, 3 interlocking circles with a single line slashed through them diagonally, that made my skin crawl and triggered a sense of recognition I couldn't place, like I had seen it as a child but been told never to ask about it. And suddenly I realized how much of my past felt orchestrated, like pieces of a story I didn't know I was part of until now. I found documents labeled with operation names, Whisper Nest, Sand Echo, Winter Signal, and each one included names of individuals flagged as either assets, liabilities, or unknowns, and to my horror, one of those names was mine, listed under an old entry dated 6 months before my father's death, marked with the note, status, dormant, proximity risk minimal unless activated, and just below that, another note had been added in red, activated, contact established. I sat back in the folding chair, staring at the screen, and the weight of it all hit me at once. Whoever had been monitoring my father hadn't stopped after he disappeared. They had shifted their attention to me, waiting, watching, calculating when or if I would get involved, and by listening to that recording, by opening that envelope, by unlocking this unit, I had triggered whatever protocol they had planned for me. I knew staying in that storage unit any longer was a mistake, even though every fiber of my being wanted to stay and keep digging until I understood everything. But something about the silence outside started to feel unnatural, like the world had gone still. And that kind of stillness only ever meant one thing: something was coming. I packed up the hard drive, shut down the generator, and left the unit exactly as I found it, locking the door behind me and walking casually back to my truck like I wasn't carrying a device filled with information that people had died trying to bury. And just as I turned the key in the ignition, I noticed a white SUV parked 2 lots over, engine running, windows tinted too dark to see through, and even though it didn't move, the way it was angled made it clear they had a view of the storage facility gate. I didn't wait to find out who was inside. I backed out, turned down a side street, and drove without stopping for nearly 4 hours, switching routes, killing my phone's GPS, and eventually ditching it altogether in a truck stop trash bin near El Paso, because if they had been tracking me through any device, I couldn't risk carrying it any longer. I checked into a motel using a name I hadn't used in years, a name my father had once taught me to memorize in case of an emergency, and when the woman at the counter asked for ID, I handed her an old expired fishing license I found in my glove box, praying she didn't care enough to check the date. I sat in that motel room with a hard drive sitting on the nightstand like a bomb, too afraid to open it again, too paranoid to sleep, and as I stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me, I kept hearing my father's voice in my head, warning me that the truth was never safe, and that anyone who got too close to it had a tendency to disappear quietly, without headlines, without goodbyes, and without justice. I knew I had to find someone else who could help me understand what I was looking at, someone who wouldn't run or lie or try to sell the information to the highest bidder, and the only name that came to mind was a former journalist my father had once mentioned in passing, a man named Bennett Shaw, who had been forced out of his job after publishing a series of exposés that implicated multiple government contractors in unauthorized surveillance of American citizens, and who had vanished from the public eye shortly after. I remembered my father saying that Bennett was one of the few people who still believed in truth even when it got ugly, and if anyone could help me piece together the full picture without getting me killed in the process, it was him, assuming he was still alive and still willing to talk to someone connected to the very world he had spent years trying to expose. I didn't know where to start looking for Bennett Shaw, especially since his name had been absent from any official platform or publication for over a decade, but I remembered something my father once told me when I was a teenager, complaining about how hard it was to find real people in a world full of fake profiles and digital noise. He said that the people who truly mattered never advertised where they were, but they always left a trail for someone who was willing to look for what others ignored. And with that thought in mind, I dug into archived web pages, forgotten forum posts, and even ancient comment threads buried under conspiracy videos with 4 views, until I found a username, EchoWriter75, that had posted cryptic phrases and location-based riddles on a now-defunct forum dedicated to declassified Cold War operations, and buried in one of those threads was a clue that referenced a windowless diner near the border where the coffee tastes like regret and the jukebox only plays Johnny Cash, which seemed like nonsense until I realized there was in fact a diner that matched that exact description just outside Marfa, Texas, known to truckers and loners as the kind of place you went when you wanted to be forgotten, not fed. I drove there without stopping, cutting through back roads and keeping my face obscured at gas stations just in case any camera was still tied to whatever system had once monitored my father. And when I finally pulled into the gravel lot behind the diner, it was nearly midnight and the air smelled like old oil, desert wind, and something that felt like unfinished business. Inside, the place was empty except for one man sitting in the corner booth facing the wall, wearing a worn-out baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses even though it was pitch dark. And as soon as I stepped through the door, he looked up like he had been expecting me since sunset, nodded once, and gestured for me to sit without saying a word. I didn't ask if he was Bennett Shaw, because I knew, the same way you know when lightning is about to strike or when a dream is more than just your imagination. And as soon as I slid into the booth across from him, he reached into his coat, pulled out a burner phone, and typed something without showing me the screen before placing it face down between us and saying, "We have 5 minutes before they triangulate the signal, so talk fast and only the truth." I told him everything about the call, the cabin, the notebook, the files, the recording, the storage unit, and finally the hard drive sitting in my backpack that I hadn't dared to open since Carrillo Springs. And he didn't interrupt once, just nodded slowly, his fingers tapping a rhythm against the tabletop like he was keeping time with some invisible clock counting down the seconds until we had to disappear again. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and said, "Your father was deeper in than I thought, deeper than any of us were, and if he trusted you with this, then it means he knew the end was coming and he wanted the story out, but not all at once and not loud, because volume gets you erased, quiet gets you remembered." He handed me a flash drive and told me to copy the contents of the hard drive onto it, but only the folder labeled Exit Protocol, and to deliver it to a man named Howard Lynn who ran a printing press in Denver that served as a front for whistleblower publications that never touched the internet and never left physical trails. And then he pulled out a napkin, wrote 3 words on it, Glasslight, Harvest, and June, and folded it into my hand, telling me that if I ever heard those words in sequence from someone I didn't know, I was to walk away without speaking and leave everything behind because it meant they had found me. I wanted to ask more, to know how he'd survived this long and what exactly my father had done to get marked as a liability by a program that wasn't supposed to exist. But the lights in the diner flickered twice and Bennett stood up, nodded once more, and walked out the back without paying or looking back, disappearing into the night like a ghost with a deadline. I followed his instructions, drove north without using highways, stayed at roadside motels with cash-only policies, and when I reached Denver, I found the printing shop exactly where he said it would be, disguised as a rundown antique store that smelled like newspaper ink and pipe smoke. And when I walked in and asked for Mr. Lynn, the man behind the counter didn't even blink, just nodded, locked the front door, and led me through a narrow hallway into a room filled with old printing equipment and boxes of pamphlets that looked like they hadn't been touched since the 70s. I handed him the flash drive and told him what it was, and he didn't say anything at first, just turned it over in his hands like it was heavier than it looked, then asked me if I knew the cost of finishing a story that someone else died to begin, and when I didn't answer, he nodded and said, "Then you're not ready to stop yet, and that's the only kind of person I can work with." He said it would take a few days to process the data and turn it into something that could be safely distributed, coded, and embedded into a series of fake manuals for old appliances that would be mailed to contacts across the country, people who knew how to read between the lines and piece together truths from what looked like nonsense. As I left his shop, I felt something shift in me, not relief, not safety, but a strange kind of clarity, like I was no longer just running or reacting. I was part of the resistance my father had died to protect, and whether I wanted it or not, the next move was mine to make. I didn't expect what came next, though by this point I should have known better than to think anything about this journey would unfold in a straight line or follow a rhythm I could predict, because less than 48 hours after leaving Howard Lynn's shop, I woke up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Cheyenne to find my truck door cracked open, my glove box rifled through, and a single item placed carefully on the passenger seat where I couldn't miss it, a cassette tape labeled only with my name and a date that hadn't arrived arrived yet, which sent a chill through my bones like I was being watched not from a distance, but from a place much closer, like the air itself had been listening to my every step. There was no sign of forced entry, no security footage, and nothing missing. Not even the burner phone I had powered off and wrapped in aluminum foil like Carl once suggested, and the way the cassette had been left, not as a threat, but as an invitation, made me realize that whoever was following me wasn't trying to stop me. Not yet anyway. They were waiting for me to do something specific, something irreversible, and only then would they make their move. I found an old tape player at a pawn shop 20 miles outside of town, paid in cash, and drove into the hills until I found a place with no signal, no traffic, no line of sight. And when I finally pressed play, the voice that came through the static wasn't my father's or anyone I recognized, but it spoke with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing how a story ends before the last chapter is written. The voice said my father's exit wasn't clean, that the Dove protocol hadn't collapsed but had only splintered, creating smaller, more dangerous factions that operated without any oversight, and that some of those factions considered me an asset worth activating while others saw me as a threat to be neutralized before I understood my true value to the architecture of what they had built. It spoke of systems, not governments or agencies, but systems that fed on silence and obedience, systems that didn't care who won elections or wrote laws because they controlled the ink and the pen and the stories that were allowed to be remembered. And it warned me that the moment I handed over the exit protocol files, I had stepped across a line that couldn't be erased, that I had unknowingly triggered a chain of events already in motion, and that from now on, the only protection I had was forward momentum and complete unpredictability. The voice said I would receive one final message before the endgame began, and that when I did, I would have a choice: to disappear or to detonate, to vanish into obscurity and live in shadows, or to release something into the world that could never be contained again, something my father spent his final years assembling piece by piece under the illusion that he was protecting me by keeping me ignorant. When the tape ended, I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, staring at the clouds drifting over the plains, trying to decide whether I had already crossed the threshold of no return or if I still had a chance to pull back, erase my steps, and rebuild a life that didn't involve dead drops, aliases, or encrypted files hidden inside toaster oven manuals. But deep down, I knew that any return to normalcy was a fantasy reserved for people who had never learned the cost of truth, and that I was already too far in, not because of what I'd done, but because of what I now knew. And knowledge like this doesn't go away. It eats at you, wakes you up at 3 a.m. with questions no one else dares to ask, and I wasn't built to carry those questions quietly. I returned to Denver one last time, planning to retrieve the original hard drive from Lynn before disappearing for good. But when I arrived at the print shop, the place was gone. Boards over the windows, the door welded shut, and scorch marks along the sidewall that told me fire had been involved, though whether it was accidental or deliberate, I couldn't say. I walked the block twice, asked the neighboring businesses if they'd seen anything, but no one remembered the place ever being open, like it had been erased not just physically but historically, which meant whoever had come for Lynn hadn't just wanted to stop the leak, they wanted to erase the entire leak's existence. I returned to my motel to find the room cleaned out, no sign of my belongings, not even the bedspread was the same, and the clerk at the front desk claimed no one by my name had ever stayed there, even though I remembered handing him the exact bills, remembered the wallpaper, remembered the flickering light outside my door that had kept me awake half the night. I had become a ghost in a story I was supposed to forget, and that was when I knew. They weren't going to come at me with bullets or subpoenas, they were going to erase me piece by piece, one document, one database, one face-to-face memory at a time, until even I started to question whether I had ever existed outside of my own mind. But before they could finish the job, I needed to finish what my father had started, not out of revenge or pride, but because someone had to, and if not me, then who? Because silence wasn't an option anymore, and even ghosts deserve a voice. I knew I couldn't trust anyone else to carry the truth to the finish line, not after what happened to Howard Lynn, not after how easily the records of my motel stay were scrubbed, and the people I had spoken to acted like I was a shadow drifting through places I didn't belong. And even though part of me still hoped for a way out, a final exit that didn't involve setting fire to everything behind me, I also knew that stories like this only end one of two ways: with silence or with sacrifice, and I wasn't willing to die without knowing at least some part of what my father had built would survive in the minds of people who would never meet me, never know my name, but who might carry the truth forward in whispers, in questions, in warnings passed between strangers who still believed in something larger than comfort or safety. I went completely off-grid for 5 days, using back roads, burner phones, and maps that had more creases than ink, and eventually I reached a compound deep in the hills of northern Montana where I knew I could upload the entire exit protocol to a buried system my father had once shown me on a napkin sketch when I was 12, claiming it was just a story for when the world ended and we needed to start over from scratch. But now I realized he had been giving me the key long before I even knew. There was a door. The bunker was buried beneath an old barn covered in rust and overgrown vines, and the entry code hadn't changed, still the numbers of the street I grew up on in Cleveland, the same code he once used for our garage keypad, as if some part of him had hoped I would remember it even when everything else was gone. Inside, the air was stale and the lights flickered on only after I manually flipped the breakers, but the servers were still running, humming like they hadn't slept in years, and when I connected the hard drive, the system came alive like it had been waiting for this moment, asking me for a voice confirmation, which I gave without hesitation, and then it began transferring the data into what appeared to be a fragmented distribution grid, splitting the information into hundreds of encrypted packets and sending them to satellite nodes linked to old university networks, abandoned weather stations, and repurposed telecom relays across 3 continents, places no centralized authority could reach without months of hunting, if they even knew where to look. The screen blinked once, then twice, then displayed one final message that stopped my heart cold. Transfer complete. Begin blackout sequence. And I knew that if I clicked yes, there would be no way to trace the origin, no way to undo what I had started, no way to reverse the flood once the dam cracked open. And as I hovered over the button, I thought about my father, about the way he used to sit silently on the back porch at night staring at the stars like he was searching for a version of himself he had lost long ago. And I realized that in that silence was the exact answer I needed, because silence was where they had kept us for years, and silence was exactly what I was here to destroy. I clicked yes without another thought, and the screen went dark, the servers shut down, the air grew still, and I stood there in the darkness knowing that somewhere, in dozens of places I would never see, the truth was now alive and out of reach. I burned everything else in the barn, documents, devices, even my backpack. Took nothing with me except a notebook with one page left blank where I wrote a single sentence for whoever might find it one day. This wasn't an accident, and it didn't end here. I disappeared that night without leaving a trail, and for a long time I didn't speak to anyone, didn't tell my story, didn't try to prove anything, because I understood something most people never do. Sometimes the loudest truth is the one you don't hear until everything else stops. If you're listening to this now, if this recording survived the sweep and found its way to your hands, then you already know that the world you live in isn't built on justice or honesty, but on the silence between what's allowed to be seen and what's buried before it breathes. And if I'm gone, if my name doesn't exist anymore, then let this story be my witness. Let this voice remind you that no matter how far they reach, no matter how deeply they erase, someone always remembers, someone always questions, someone always survives.